Joining me now, U.S. Managing Editor of the Financial Times, Gillian Tett, and Mark Landler, who is the White House correspondent at the New York Times. So, Gillian, what's your big takeaway as you look at the results of this election in France?
Well, the big takeaway is that the French voters are fed up with the status quo, because right now the markets are celebrating the fact that Macron won the first round. There was concern you could end up with a runoff between Mélenchon, who's the far-left candidate, and Le Pen, who's the far-right. That hasn't happened. But no one should lose sight of the fact that Macron himself is actually, if not anti-establishment, he's someone who's not inside the political mainstream. He hasn't come through the normal political route at all. And 3/4 of the voters plumped for candidates who were outside the parties. 49% went for candidates who were backing essentially positions against the EU. That is not a happy voter base.
So in the meantime, we have the, I guess you would call it, the final vote coming up. So, Mark, how do you see this going? Where does it stand now? What's it going to look like between now and when they go to the polls?
Well, what's happened in the immediate aftermath of the vote is that virtually every other candidate has told their voters to vote for Macron. And so Le Pen finds herself very isolated. And this is a familiar pattern in France. When the National Front has gotten through to the final round of voting, typically voters have thrown in very decisively against the National Front. And that would imply that Macron should win. I think the only reason people aren't considering that a foreordained possibility is that we've all been surprised before by elections that have not gone the way everybody predicted they would. Nonetheless, Marine Le Pen would look to have a very, very uphill struggle because so many of the voters that voted for François Fillon or some of the other candidates will now throw in behind Macron. It's kind of difficult to see how she puts together enough new votes, broadens her base enough to prevail in the next round.
And since he's tweeted about it, and even though President Trump says he's not making an endorsement, does he seem to want Le Pen to win?
Well, he clearly came as close as you can get to an endorsement without officially doing so. Look, she would represent a validation of his populist appeal and the message that he triumphed on, and it would be in keeping with the Brexit vote and his victory last fall. But it is worth noting that populist candidates have not done particularly well in Europe in the months since the U.S. election. In the Netherlands, the Populist Party did less well than expected in the parliamentary race. The Austrian voters elected a Green Party candidate over the far-right populist for the post of president. So the populist wave really didn't gather force after Trump was elected. And although Marine Le Pen got into the final round, if she loses by a decisive margin, it will not look as though Trump was auguring a populist wave across Europe. In fact, it might almost look like there's a bit of a Trump backlash at work here. So I think the White House is probably watching this with a realistic eye. I mean, they can read the polls and see the trends as well as anyone else can.
Yeah, meantime, the former president made a phone call to Macron. Let's take a listen to that.
The main message I have is to wish you all the best in the coming days, and make sure that, as you said, you work hard all the way through, because you never know. It might be that last day of campaigning that
yeah, I do agree.
Makes all the difference.
I will do my best, believe me, and so I will fight till the last minute, and we will keep it in touch.
So, Gillian, all the analysts I read say that he's going to win, that really Le Pen has no chance. But you have to think in the back of her mind, and maybe in the mind of voters, that was also said about President Trump. A call like that, what do you make of it? And does Barack Obama have any influence over there? Are the people of France listening to that phone call?
Well, coming from the UK election, having watched that, certainly when Barack Obama got involved in that by essentially telling people to back Remain, that backfired very, very badly indeed. And anyone who is an internationalist or an Anglo-Saxon perspective will look at that call and say, oh, Macron, he speaks English beautifully. That's wonderful. For French people, the fact that you've got somebody who is so internationalist does not necessarily play that well. And what people need to realize is in this Macron versus Le Pen runoff right now, they're essentially at a crossroads. Macron is not just internationalist who speaks English, he favors a lot more European integration. Le Pen is anti-Europe. And whatever you want to say about the French mood right now, there's signs that they are pretty anti-European.
So, Mark, between Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, and now you're seeing in France, it's been decades since you've seen two candidates go into the runoff who do not have the affiliation of the sort of traditional standard centrist parties. I mean, is the whole world ticked off? Is everybody just sick of what's going on in their country? Is there some big global thing that we should be looking at least in terms of the West?
Well, look, there's no question that there's a sort of a wholesale cross-border rejection of established politics, established parties, a status quo approach to governance. You know, the Independence Party tapped into it in Britain. Donald Trump tapped into it in the U.S. And Marine Le Pen clearly tapped into it to finish second in this, you know, in the first round. And frankly, Emmanuel Macron did as well. And one of the things that White House officials will note is regardless of whether Macron or Le Pen wins in 2 weeks, they would argue that the two-party system in France is in deep trouble, if not irreparably harmed by this result. I mean, there's rejection of the two major parties is profound. And regardless of whether Macron or Le Pen wins, I think the White House would argue that it's a vindication for insurgent candidates. And Donald Trump is, at heart, an insurgent candidate. Indeed, you might argue that if you look at his cabinet and some of the people he's surrounded himself with, they look a lot like Emmanuel Macron. So there are elements of Trump on both sides of the equation in France, with the caveat, of course, that Macron is fundamentally an internationalist, and that's very much what Trump ran against last fall.
Mark Landler, Gillian Tett, thank you both. Appreciate it.